You gotta have knowledge for life. You gotta have it. You gotta have it. You gotta have knowledge for life. You gotta have it. You gotta have it. You gotta have knowledge for life. You gotta have it. You got.
So the real thing about history is the understanding of a value system. The fundamental question is, what do you stand for? What are your values? All of us sitting in this room did not just suddenly drop. We are all part of a value system. We are all part of a group. We are all part of a community. History is a story about people. It's about understanding how a community has shaped itself over time. It's about understanding how people have lived their lives over time. And history must have meaning. So we want to study, and pretty much what Ms. McCoy and Reverend McCoy have said, Ms. Peters and Reverend McCoy have stated, that when you get into studying history, it is one thing to memorize the facts and dates. But one of the fundamental questions we ask is, how does history inform our present? How does history inform our lives? When I got into the study of history, especially as I studied history a little more detailedly, that was one of the key questions. Everything about history should have a meaning, should have some way of influence the way we live. Earlier, we talked about some of the problems which the African American community face. And these problems did not suddenly begin today. These problems are deeply rooted in history. All of you probably heard the name W.E.B. Du Bois. In one of the pamphlets, a book which he published in 1903, The Souls of Black Folk, he asked a fundamental question in that book. Will America be America without its black people? A very significant question, right? When you look at the black experience in America, and it's been ably stated, that when we talk about African American history, we must contextualize it within American history. Because African American history, if we study African American history as just something on the side, then we are actually promoting the study of some type of segregated history. And the question about it is that if you look at some of the central themes in the understanding of American history, virtually every theme, as Peter talked about, before the Civil War, you cannot study American history for the Civil War, or the Civil War, without understanding the story of black people. The story of black people is deeply integrated in this history. Again, one of the things, as I said earlier, that history is particularly important for us because it teaches us our traditions. It teaches us our values. It has already been stated that many of those who do not have a sense of history spend their life drifting. And so, out of our history, out of our past, we have what we have today. And one of the fundamental challenges that we must engage ourselves in, when we study history, we learn, we appreciate what has been done in the past, we enjoy some of the things which have been left for us by those who went before, but we must challenge ourselves. It is not enough to inherit. One of the fundamental questions is, what are we doing to add to the next, to what the next generation will get? So it's not enough. So one of the real challenges, which, and I say this a lot to people when I talk, my students at the University of Dayton, sometimes they accuse me of overkill, that sometimes I say too much about some of these things. That is not enough to study history. It's not enough to see the good things. I mean, we all know the story of the Civil Rights Movement. We are all standing on the shoulders of the Civil Rights Movement. Without the Civil Rights Movement, I come originally from Cameroon in West Africa. Right? I've been living in the United States for 26 years. We have a program in Africa. Most of my research is in Africa, in different countries. But without the Civil Rights Movement, clearly I would not be standing here giving this talk. Right? So clearly the Civil Rights marches, and it was ably stated. Sometimes people say that history is a study of lucky people, in the sense that those true movers and shakers, those who really make things happen, their names never appear in the books. Right? Martin Luther King would never have been a leader without the foot soldiers, without the grassroots people. Malcolm X would never have been a leader without the foot soldiers, without the grassroots people. So these grassroots people, the rank and file, the masses, the people who they mobilize, the people whose stories, whose names will never appear in the books, they're all responsible, I think, for all of us being able to get into the bus and walk through the bus and sit down instead of paying the toll up front, walk out and enter through the rear. These are simple things which are so critical because they go right to the heart of what it means to be human, right? So history is a story about trying to find out how each generation defined what it means to be human. History is a story about trying to construct our identity. One of the fundamental questions we must ask ourselves, what does it mean to be African American in America in 2008? History deals with change over time. And one of the things I mentioned that I teach African American history, I teach African history. And we ask this question all through. In 1900, what does it mean to be African American? In 1920, what does it mean to be African American? In 1930, this is so important because we understand the story of hope. We understand the story of endurance. We understand the story of protest. We understand the story of proud people who are doing the best to build a community despite all the odds. I mean, so it is the story of the African American people. It is a story of the oppressed. So history is so critical in us trying to understand this story about the people. Again, one of the things I said earlier is that when we study history, we're trying to understand who we are. History helps us to construct our identity. How does the African American construct his or her identity? What does it mean, again, to be African American? How is that identity constructed, right? I mean, so you find, for example, the whole story of race. I mean, the other day in one of my classes, we were talking about the construction of the racial identity in America, that it is based on scientific fraud. And so one of the things you find here is that racial identity in America is socially constructed. And that's why you could find a lot of cases of passing, right? It's not based on any science. It's based on where you live, which school you went to, which never. So clearly, and of course, this racial identity changed over time. As you look at the census data in the 1900s, you look at the census data in the 1930s, you look at the census data in the 1960s, there are changes. And so history helps us to begin to make sense, help us to try to understand and hold a nation accountable, help us to, when we study Martin Luther King, when we study Malcolm X, when we study Frederick Douglass, when we study Ida B. Wells, when we study Mary McLeod Bethune, it's not so much that we're interested in the story. We're trying to see in what ways we can emulate their lives. These are people who made a significant contribution. How can we be like them? How can we challenge ourselves to do the things they did? These are people who acted out of history. They didn't just go along. They didn't just say, let's get along, everything is fine. They didn't just accommodate, right? These are people who said, every so often, every generation must stand up to the truth. Every generation must stand up to what it means to be human. Why should we study history? Because it informs the lives we live. It challenges us to be better people. It challenges us, where the Reverend talked earlier about the need to be good to our neighbors. King said at one point, this quotation may be wrong, that at a certain point, everyone is potentially another one's neighbor. Right? And so be good to your neighbor. So history challenges us to do those type of things.